The bonds of brotherhood forged in war run deeper than time, deeper than conspiracy. This is a story of honor, betrayal, and a promise kept against all odds. The sound of the taser cut through the silence of the cemetery like a dry thunderclap, and Sergeant Elijah Vance collapsed to his knees beside his wife's still fresh grave. His hands shook violently as 50,000 volts coursed through his 68-year-old body, the same body that had carried wounded comrades through Vietnamese jungles decades ago. The Purple Heart medal on his chest burned against his skin like a hot iron. "Stop resisting," shouted Officer Mark Thorne, holding the electric gun pointed at the veteran writhing on the damp grass. But Elijah wasn't resisting. He was just trying to breathe, trying to understand how he had arrived at this nightmarish moment on the day he buried Grace, his companion of 44 years. The taste of blood filled his mouth as he bit his tongue involuntarily. 3 hours earlier, Elijah had held the folded American flag that covered his wife's coffin, his eyes dry because the tears simply wouldn't come anymore. The pastor had spoken about Grace as if he had known her, but his words sounded empty to Elijah. How could anyone capture a lifetime of love in a few minutes? Grace had battled cancer for 2 years, and he had been by her side through every chemotherapy session, every sleepless night, every moment of hope and despair. She had been a nurse at the university hospital for 35 years, a woman who had dedicated her life to caring for others and who died with only him to care for her. In the last few months, when the disease had made her too frail to work, she had spent her mornings on the porch watching the birds and telling stories about the patients she had helped over the years. Elijah had memorized every one of those stories, knowing that one day they would be all he had left of her. Now she lay beneath the cold October earth, and something inside him refused to leave her alone. The people had left after the service, distant relatives, a few co-workers, neighbors who had come to pay their respects. But Elijah remained. How could he go home and sit in her empty chair? How could he sleep in the bed that still smelled of the perfume she had worn for decades? Green Valley Cemetery had officially closed at 6 p.m., but Elijah remained motionless beside the grave, whispering memories that only she could understand. He talked about the grandchildren she would never see grow up, about the retirement plans they would never make, about how he didn't know how to live without her laughter echoing through the empty house. He told her about the electric bill he had forgotten to pay and how he always burned the coffee when he tried to make it himself. That's when Officer Thorne appeared, emerging from the evening mist like a ghost dressed in blue. Young and impatient, with only 6 months on the force and something to prove, Thorne had received a call about suspicious activity at the cemetery. He saw an elderly black man in a closed cemetery and made assumptions that changed everything. His boots clattered against the gravel as he approached, his hand already resting on his baton. "Sir, the cemetery is closed," Thorne said, his voice heavy with feigned authority. When Elijah explained about the funeral, about his wife, about just needing a moment to say goodbye, Thorne checked his watch and declared that rules were rules. There was something in his eyes, a coldness that Elijah recognized from other moments in his life, the look of someone who had already decided how the situation would end. When Elijah asked for just 5 minutes to say goodbye properly, Thorne saw defiance where there was only pain. The veteran tried to explain about the 44 years of marriage, about how Grace always calmed him when the Vietnam nightmares came back, about how she was the only person who understood why he sometimes woke up screaming. But Thorne wasn't interested in stories. The escalation was quick and brutal. Elijah, confused and exhausted from grief, sat heavily on a nearby bench, saying he needed a moment to collect himself. His legs simply couldn't hold him up anymore. Thorne interpreted this as resistance, as a direct challenge to his authority. The handcuffs came first, cold against the veteran's wrists that had held Grace's hand in her final moments. "Please," Elijah whispered. "She just died. I just need to." But his words were cut off by the electric buzz of the taser. The pain was unlike any injury he had ever suffered on the battlefield. It wasn't just physical. It was a humiliation that cut deeper than any bullet. Now, as Elijah slowly regained control of his muscles, one question echoed in his dazed mind: why did Thorne seem so nervous, constantly checking his phone, and why had he mentioned something about superior orders when he called for backup? There was something planned about this meeting, something Elijah couldn't quite grasp yet. Across town, at a naval base 15 minutes away, a special alert began flashing on a computer screen. The name Elijah Vance appeared in red letters, accompanied by a military record that made the operator gulp. If you're enjoying this story of courage and brotherhood, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that honor our true heroes. 3 patrol cars arrived in less than 5 minutes, their sirens cutting through the peace of the cemetery like blades. Thorne had called for backup, claiming violent suspect resisting arrest. But there was something else in his tone of voice, an urgency that didn't match the situation. As Elijah tried to get up from the ground, still shaking from the shock, Thorne whispered quickly into the radio. Words that the veteran couldn't quite make out, confirmed target located. "Yes, sir. We're proceeding as planned," Thorne muttered, turning away so Elijah couldn't hear. But one word escaped him clearly: elimination. Elijah felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the dampness of the cemetery. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. Officer Mark Thorne had lied about his 6 months on the force. In fact, he had been part of a special unit for 3 years, specializing in operations that never appeared in official reports. His real name was Robert Vance, a former soldier who had been dishonorably discharged from the Army for excessive brutality. The Riverside Police Department had become his refuge, and certain corrupt elements within the department had become his protectors. Elijah Vance wasn't just any veteran. During the Vietnam War, he had witnessed something that could destroy entire political careers, a drug smuggling operation involving high-ranking American officers. For decades, he had kept quiet, protected by Grace, who always convinced him that some secrets were too dangerous to reveal. But with her death, certain powerful people began to worry about what Elijah might decide to do with that information. "You shouldn't have come back here, Robert Vance," Thorne said quietly, crouching down beside the fallen veteran. "Some people would prefer that certain stories remain buried with their dead." Elijah looked into the officer's eyes and saw something he recognized immediately: the cold stare of someone trained to kill without remorse. The reinforcements that arrived were not ordinary police officers. They were men with scars on their hands and movements that were too calculated, who spoke in code and positioned themselves like soldiers on a mission. Elijah realized he had walked straight into a carefully planned trap. Grace's funeral had been the perfect moment. He would be vulnerable, isolated, and his death could easily be explained as resistance to arrest. As the handcuffs cut into his wrists, Elijah remembered Grace's last words in the hospital: "Promise me you'll tell the truth when I'm no longer here to protect you. Some lies are too heavy to carry alone." She knew this day would come. Knew that the ghosts of the past would eventually find them. Thorne checked his phone again and smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "We have the green light," he said to the other officers. "Make it look like he tried to grab my gun." Elijah felt genuine terror for the first time since Vietnam. These men weren't there to arrest him. They were there to silence him permanently. The first kick hit his ribs, hard enough to break bones. Elijah screamed in pain, a sound that echoed off the stone monuments like the lament of all the souls resting in that hallowed place. The second kick was aimed at his back, causing him to cough up blood. "Stop," he begged, but his voice came out weak and desperate. "You should have kept your mouth shut about Congressman Morrison," Thorne growled, referring to the officer who had led the smuggling operations in Vietnam and was now an influential congressman. "You should have taken those secrets to the grave with your wife." Another kick, this time to the stomach, doubled Elijah over. As the violence escalated, Elijah closed his eyes and thought of Grace lying a few feet away. He had promised her he would tell the truth, but now it looked like he would take those secrets to the grave much sooner than he had imagined. The irony was bitter: to die alongside the woman he loved, but in a way she would never have approved of. That's when Thorne made his first real mistake. In his thirst for revenge, he shouted too loudly, "This is for what you saw in Vietnam, you bastard." His words echoed across the cemetery and were clearly picked up by the security system he didn't know existed. But more importantly, they were heard by someone who was closer than anyone imagined. Across the cemetery, hidden behind a marble mausoleum, Sergeant Marcus Hayes lowered his binoculars with a grim expression. He had been watching Elijah since the funeral, not as an enemy, but as a protector. Certain promises made between brothers in arms never expire, and Marcus was about to honor one he had made decades ago. Marcus pulled out his phone and typed a 3-word message that would change everything: Operation Guardian activated. Within seconds, 6 military phones in different parts of the city received the same code. Every man who received the message immediately stopped what he was doing. One was having dinner with his family. Another was finishing a workout at the gym. A third was reviewing reports at his desk. They all understood the meaning: one of their own was in mortal danger. What Thorne and his accomplices didn't know was that Elijah Vance wasn't just an ordinary Vietnam veteran. He had been part of a special reconnaissance unit that had rescued more than 200 American prisoners of war on a classified mission that remains secret to this day. Among the men he had saved was a 19-year-old soldier named Marcus Hayes, who now commanded the Special Operations Unit at the Riverside Naval Base. Marcus remembered perfectly the day Elijah carried him 3 kilometers through the Vietnamese jungle, even though he was wounded in the shoulder, refusing to leave him behind when the other soldiers wanted to abandon him. "No man gets left behind," Elijah had said then, and those words echoed in Marcus's mind for more than 4 decades. Now it was his turn to honor that promise. Marcus's unit was no ordinary military group. They were elite Navy SEALs, specialized in urban rescue operations, each with at least 10 years of combat experience. When Marcus quickly explained the situation over the encrypted communicator, the response was unanimous and immediate. They were on their way. While Elijah continued to be beaten in the cemetery, Marcus moved silently between the graves, using approach techniques he had perfected on dozens of missions. He could see Thorne repeatedly kicking the fallen veteran, each blow causing his jaw to clench in rage. But Marcus was a professional. Emotion without strategy led to death. Through his earpiece, Marcus heard the sound of engines approaching. His men were arriving in civilian vehicles, dressed as ordinary workers, but carrying concealed military equipment. The plan was simple: surround the cemetery, neutralize the threats, and extract Elijah alive. Marcus knew each of these SEALs personally. He had trained with them, bled with them, trusted them with his life on operations that would never make the newspapers. Then Marcus discovered something that made his blood run cold. Through his interception equipment, he picked up a radio conversation between Thorne and his command: "Target neutralized in 2 minutes. Prepare the cover story." This wasn't just a silencing operation. It was a scheduled execution, and they had exactly 2 minutes before Elijah was killed in cold blood. Sergeant Kevin Torres was the first SEAL to arrive, parking his electrical maintenance van 50 yards from the cemetery. Inside the vehicle, he quickly assembled his sniper rifle and established a line of fire for 3 of the corrupt police officers. Torres had saved Elijah Vance once in Vietnam when an enemy sniper had him pinned down, and he did not intend to fail now. Corporal Leo Reed arrived from the west, scaling the cemetery wall with cat-like agility. Reed was an expert in hand-to-hand combat and had vowed to himself that he would make Thorne pay personally for what he was doing to his savior. In Vietnam, Elijah had given Reed his own food ration for a week when the young soldier was malnourished and sick. The third man to take position was Lieutenant Eric Johnson, who arrived at the main gate disguised as a late gravedigger. Johnson carried advanced communications equipment and non-lethal smoke grenades capable of temporarily blinding enemies. He owed his entire military career to Elijah, who had recommended his promotion after witnessing his courage under fire. Meanwhile, at the cemetery, Thorne drew his service weapon and pointed it at Elijah's head. "It's over, veteran. You should have kept your mouth shut about what you saw in 1971. Elijah closed his eyes, thinking of Grace and hoping she would forgive him for failing to keep his promise to reveal the truth. But then something extraordinary happened. Marcus emerged from the shadows like a silent ghost, moving with a speed that defied his age. In one fluid motion, he disarmed Thorne and knocked him to the ground before any of the other officers could react. "Remember me, you bastard?" Marcus whispered in Thorne's ear. "I was the kid you and your friends left to die in Vietnam." The revelation hit Thorne like a bolt of lightning. Marcus wasn't just any soldier. He was one of the men who had been left to die in the smuggling operation Elijah had witnessed. Thorne and the other corrupt cops weren't just the enforcers of a modern conspiracy. They were the sons and protégés of the same corrupt officers who had betrayed their own soldiers decades ago. Elijah opened his eyes and saw Marcus's face, older but still recognizable. "Marcus," he whispered, hardly believing it. "You survived." Marcus smiled, helping Elijah to his feet. "I survived because you taught me that brothers never abandon brothers. Now it's my turn to return the favor." The other policemen began to draw their weapons, but Marcus spoke calmly into his communicator. "Green light for neutralization." In a matter of seconds, 6 red laser sights appeared on the chests of the armed men, coming from different directions around the cemetery. "Drop your weapons or our snipers will neutralize you in 3 seconds." Marcus's voice echoed through the cemetery with absolute authority. The laser dots danced across the corrupt police officers' chests like red stars of death. Thorne tried to raise his pistol, but the dot of light on his forehead made him freeze. He finally understood that he had walked straight into a trap set by real professionals. The first to surrender was Officer Parks, dropping his gun into the damp grass. His eyes darted nervously, searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. The SEALs had surrounded the cemetery with military precision, blocking every possible exit. In a matter of minutes, a carefully planned assassination operation had turned into a nightmare for its executives. Marcus helped Elijah to his feet, watching with grim satisfaction as his men emerged from the shadows like avenging spirits. Torres kept his rifle trained on Thorne, while Reed flanked the other officers with movements that were deadly poetry in action. Johnson activated a signal jammer that cut off all communications between the officers and their corrupt base. "You really thought you could kill Elijah Vance and get away with it?" Marcus laughed coldly. "You have no idea who you're messing with." He pulled a tablet from his equipment and showed Thorne a series of photographs that made the cop's face go white. They were high-resolution images showing Thorne receiving money from a well-known congressman, forged documents, and even recordings of incriminating conversations. The truth was finally revealed in its entirety. The operation to silence Elijah hadn't begun with Grace's death. It had begun 3 months earlier, when Elijah sought out a lawyer to discuss the possibility of testifying about the atrocities he had witnessed in Vietnam. The lawyer, unbeknownst to Elijah, was part of the corruption network and immediately alerted his superiors to the threat. "You killed my wife," Elijah whispered, the realization hitting him like a punch in the stomach. "Her cancer got worse after you started putting something in the food I bought at the market." Marcus nodded grimly. His men had uncovered evidence of gradual poisoning with carcinogens applied to products Elijah purchased regularly. Thorne tried to deny it, but Marcus pressed a button on his tablet. Thorne's own voice echoed across the cemetery through hidden speakers. "The old woman is dying slower than we expected. Let's speed up the process, and then take care of the husband at the funeral." The recording had been captured by the SEALs during a 3-week surveillance operation. Elijah fell to his knees again, but this time it wasn't because of the electricity. It was because of the pain of discovering that Grace's last months of suffering had been artificially prolonged by monsters who wanted to use her as bait to get to him. "She suffered because of me," he moaned, pounding his fists on the floor. "She died because I was too cowardly to tell the truth." Marcus knelt beside Elijah, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "No, brother. She died because there are people in this world who sell their souls for money and power. But today, finally, we're going to get justice." He signaled to Torres, who immediately began transmitting all of the evidence they had collected to investigative journalists, federal prosecutors, and high-ranking military commanders simultaneously. The cleanup operation was executed with surgical precision. Reed neutralized 2 police officers who tried to escape using non-lethal but extremely painful combat techniques. Johnson established a security perimeter while intercepting Thorne's desperate attempts to contact his superiors for help. No one would come to save them. The network of corruption was being dismantled in real time. The most satisfying moment came when Marcus showed Thorne a photo taken in Vietnam in 1971. In the image, a wounded young soldier was being carried through a combat zone by Elijah Vance. "Recognize this kid, Thorne?" "That's me. The same kid you and your masters left for dead when you found out he witnessed you selling weapons to the enemy." Thorne finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. He hadn't just attacked an innocent veteran. He had attacked the man who had saved the life of the commander of an elite Navy SEAL unit. Every man in that unit owed his career, and in many cases his life, to Elijah Vance. They hadn't just come to rescue him. They had come to honor a blood debt. 44 years, Marcus said, his voice heavy with controlled emotion. 44 years waiting to return the favor. Elijah Vance carried me 3 miles with a bullet in his shoulder because he said no man gets left behind. Today, we carried him. Sirens began to wail in the distance, not from corrupt reinforcements, but from honest federal agents who had received the evidence Johnson had relayed. The cavalry was coming, but this time they were the good guys. Thorne and his accomplices were about to find out what it really meant to face American justice when it worked as it was supposed to. Elijah looked down at Grace's grave, tears finally streaming down his face. "Forgive me, my love," he whispered. "It took me a long time, but I'm finally telling our truth." Marcus smiled, knowing that the promise made on Grace's deathbed would be fulfilled. The truth was about to come out, and those responsible for decades of suffering would pay the full price for their crimes. 6 months later, Elijah Vance stood at the podium of the U.S. Congress, his voice steady as it echoed through the microphone to a packed audience. Television cameras captured every word as he finally told the truth he had kept hidden for 5 decades. At his side, Marcus and his SEALs wore their dress uniforms, a wall of honor protecting the man who had once saved them. In 1971, I witnessed American officers selling weapons and medical supplies to the Vietnamese enemy, Elijah declared, his voice clear and unshaken. These betrayals cost the lives of hundreds of American soldiers. I remained silent for decades to protect my family, but my wife, Grace, made me promise that the truth would be told. He paused, looking at the photo of Grace he held in his hands. "This is my promise being fulfilled, my love." Thorne had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the trial, evidence revealed that he was part of a corruption network that stretched from Vietnam to the present day, including 3 congressmen, 2 retired generals, and dozens of officers from different corporations. What began as an attempt to silence a veteran turned into the biggest military corruption scandal in American history. The grocery store where Elijah bought his groceries was shut down after investigations revealed that the owners were part of the poisoning scheme. Forensic evidence confirmed that carcinogenic substances had been systematically added to the products Elijah bought regularly, accelerating Grace's cancer and prolonging her suffering unnecessarily. Those responsible received sentences ranging from 25 years to life in prison. The most shocking revelation came when investigators discovered that Grace had known about the poisoning in her final months. She had found evidence in medical tests that didn't make sense but chose not to tell Elijah to spare him the guilt. Her last words, "Promise me you'll tell the truth," took on an even deeper meaning. She knew her death would be used as a trap and wanted to ensure that Elijah would survive to expose the corruption. Marcus was promoted to Commander General of Naval Special Operations, a position he used to create a national program to protect veterans with sensitive information. The Eternal Guardian program has already protected more than 200 veterans from similar threats, proving that the military brotherhood extends far beyond the battlefield. Elijah used the settlement money, more than $15 million, to create the Grace Vance Foundation, dedicated to providing free medical care to wives of veterans with cancer. The first medical center was built near Green Valley Cemetery, where Elijah visited Grace every day to tell her about the lives being saved in her memory. The empty house Elijah dreaded returning to became a sanctuary of happy memories. With the help of Marcus and his men, he organized the stories Grace had told him about her patients and published them in a book titled Angels in White. All proceeds went to hospitals that treated veterans and their families, creating a cycle of healing that Grace would have proudly approved. 3 years later, on Grace's death anniversary, Elijah was no longer alone at the cemetery. Marcus and all the SEALs from the unit came to pay their respects, along with hundreds of veterans and families who had been helped by the Foundation. Grace's grave was covered with flowers and American flags, a visual testament to the impact her death had had on the fight against corruption. "She saved more lives dead than many do alive," Marcus said, placing a white rose on the grave. Elijah smiled through his tears, finally at peace with his conscience. The promise had been fulfilled. Justice had prevailed, and the love between he and Grace had grown into something greater than either of them could have imagined. During the ceremony, Elijah read a letter he had written to Grace on the first anniversary of her death. "My love, I have discovered that you did not die in vain. Your death exposed corruption that had been killing our brothers for decades. You were my hero in life, and you remain my hero even after you're gone. Our story proves that true love is stronger than any conspiracy, that the truth always finds a way to come out, and that brothers in arms never forget their oaths." The most powerful lesson from Elijah and Grace's story wasn't about corruption or military justice. It was about the transformative power of love and loyalty. When ordinary people refuse to accept injustice, when veterans honor their oaths even decades later, when the love between two people inspires actions that save hundreds of others, that's where we find the true essence of American greatness. Today, Elijah Vance is 71 years old and continues to visit Grace every day. But now he is accompanied by Marcus, who became the brother he never had, and surrounded by an extended family of veterans who understand that some promises are too sacred to be broken. If this story of courage, justice, and eternal love touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories that show how the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to the light.